Hello! Today I'm taking a look at Final Fantasy VII with some discussion, suggestion and thoughts on how the saga could or should progress, if not necessarily end, and how the story appears to be unfolding from this point on. Now, this has been prompted by some comments and conversations around the small but significant changes that have taken place in the Final Fantasy VII Remake so far, which looked at a certain way, appear to have altered the characteristics and the drama of the original title, and indeed lowered the stakes in many respects, particularly looking at the strange survival of our Avalanche comrades, the reappearance of Zack, whose apparent survival has raised many questions about the trajectory of the game story, and we have the curiously prescient Aerith, who, along with Sephiroth, has an apparent awareness, or at least a suspicion, of future events, and may be intent on influencing it one way or another. And all of this, or rather much of it in the game events, is hinged on the presence of the Whispers, who it is generally accepted were the personification of fate, attempting to retain events of the original timeline and maintain this canonical 1997 sort of story. And vying against them, we have the prescient Sephiroth, whose constant presence and vindictive meddling seems intent on creating this causal shift and butterfly effect that shifts things in his favour. So, quite an interesting narrative spanner in the works, if you like. Interesting stuff that's been met with equally controversy for its adultery of the original story, but also acclaim from some fans for the refreshing newness and unknowability of what is now in store with the subtle but important changes to the overall story. But several comments and discussions around this have perhaps rightly been concerned about the near universal survival so far of characters who we know to have died in the original timeline. And while Biggs, Wedge and Jessie weren't major characters, it was still quite sad and distressing to see them die, in the tragic way that they did, hanging off the railings of the plate and taking a swan dive off the top in the case of Wedge. And even though we'd only spent an hour or so of the game with them, it threw into perspective the actions of Avalanche, and the reactions of Shinra had consequences, and indeed consequences that echoed out across the later game. And characters such as Barrett, his resolve was strengthened by the death of his comrades, and so on. So, in allowing these characters to live, regardless of how much we may like them, it does have the adverse effect of lowering the stakes for players, narratively speaking. And while we may still consider Shinra as duplicitous and evil through their actions in the remake, nothing irredeemable or emotionally poignant and personal has happened to us as yet. They haven't crossed that Rubicon by murdering our allies or anything like this. And likewise with Zack's appearances, the original plot and this sacrifice for Cloud and his tragic non-farewell to Aerith and so on has been erased by the looks of it too. And this sort of thing is important for stories, particularly fantasy stories, I'd argue, because it's the high stakes and it's the consequences that really affect audiences and really emotionally invest us in this narrative, in the cause of the protagonists and the overall story. And indeed, if we think of momentous scenes and scenarios in other media, we can see where high stakes and consequences are among the most memorable elements of certain franchises. So for example, if we think about emotive and memorable moments in the Lord of the Rings movies, many might instantly think of the death of Boromir, which was an incredibly kind of potent scene. In the Star Wars movies, we might think of the demise of Obi-Wan, the death of Qui-Gon Jinn or Yoda, and in Harry Potter, it may be the death of Sirius Black, Dumbledore, or Harry Potter's various friends in the final movie. And so, by omitting this from Final Fantasy VII, there has been a concern among some that this emotive impact and this sort of weight that was present very early on in the original game is being stripped away in favour of fan service and elevating and characterising characters and a changing story for the sake of being different more than anything else. Now, I get that, and I appreciate those concerns, because regardless of whether you think changing the original game events is a good thing or not, from a purely narrative storytelling perspective, not having stakes and consequences would make for a pretty mediocre experience overall. But for my part, I am quite confident that we are building towards something momentous and indeed tragic in this retelling of Final Fantasy VII. And there's already foreshadowing elements that we can glimpse in the remake that lend to this idea, particularly things like Sephiroth's ominous mention to Cloud of having 7 seconds towards the end of the game and things like that. And there's been a few theories around this and what it might mean. Admittedly, the best I've read was 7 seconds being the amount of time that passes between Sephiroth appearances in the remake, which did make me laugh. But more seriously, there are many that contest that 7 seconds is the amount of time it takes for Aerith to get killed by Sephiroth, which I actually checked the FMV, and yes, if you start counting from the moment that the camera tilts upwards to show Sephiroth, it is roughly 7 seconds that it takes for him to descend and impale her, while others still have contended that this 7 seconds is to do with Cloud averting Zack's death in the past, and various things like that. So, for my part, I'm loath to speculate too much about it, but something I am confident of because of these sort of ominous signs, and looping back to this butterfly effect, which is the idea that small shifts in time, small shifts in events, can have momentous implications and impacts on things later down the line. I think that this shifting of fate is that there will be implications and consequences from these actions, whatever they might be. And while Square has come under fire in recent years, in part for some of their sort of narrative design and character arcs in various games, I do feel that they've always been pretty competent at giving with one hand and taking with the other, and having these kind of tragic elements in their stories. Now, looking to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Rebirth and beyond, I do think we're in for something quite momentous. And where speculation is rife that because Zack appears to have survived, maybe Aerith will survive as well. As I say, I think the story will give with one hand and take with the other, and I think Zack surviving and potentially Aerith surviving can only come at the expense of another tragic event or another set of characters endangered, whether that's Tifa or Cloud or the wider party. So whatever this 7-second decision might be, which almost certainly resides in a decision for Cloud, or perhaps even the player to choose. And I think ultimately it's going to come down to a point where it's going to have to either correct or reinforce this new tangent timeline. And I think you can almost picture some momentous scene towards the end where all of these incorrectly surviving souls, such as Zack, Biggs, Wedge, Jesse, Aerith, sort of dissolve off into the ether of the live stream, or something like that, as time restores itself. So that's something I can sort of picture happening in this momentous decision. But again, merely speculation at this point, and there's several other things to consider here too, such as how and why Zack has survived, because this naturally occurs prior to the events of Final Fantasy VII proper. So has Sephiroth gone even further back than we think? Additionally, is Zack alive in a tangent timeline yet again, because of course Cloud is in possession of the Buster Sword in the remake, so Zack has obviously passed this to him and perished. So we need clarity around these certain things, and there's a lot of variables and a lot of unknowns. But my personal opinion and my conviction is that Final Fantasy VII hasn't gone soft. It hasn't offered to give fans a happily ever after. And indeed, I think it's going to come to a very climactic conclusion in these future instalments, where the tangent timelines or this altered reality needs to correct itself, and this is the high stakes and emotive weight that will affect us as fans. Hopefully, in a way that will do justice to the legacy and the overall overarching game story of Final Fantasy VII. So, there we have it, some brief thoughts and opinions on the story trajectory and where potentially it's going. If you got this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions and theories onto where you think this story's going.